I'm delighted to welcome Dr Anna Carlile to come and share some of her research and writing. She's published a book about the LGBTQI inclusive education in schools serving faith communities. This theme comes up a lot in the kind of the tensions within the Equality Act and the tensions within protected characteristics. So I'm really excited to hear from you, Anna, in helping people move the conversation and the action forward. Over to you.
Thanks, Hannah, and I've been really inspired by all the talks that we've heard this morning. This is such a great event. So I work at Goldsmiths in the Department for Educational Studies, and I'm a member of the Centre for Identities and Social Justice. Some of the work that I'm going to be talking about is published in some of these books. There are other articles as well. So if you want to read more, just drop me a line on Twitter or by email, and I'll send you whatever it is that you need. I just wanted to start out by talking about my own positioning. So my pronouns are she, her. I'm a lesbian parent and a former teacher. I also grew up in a Jewish Catholic family, and I'm really interested in thinking about this issue because it's a great route into a kind of intersectional analysis. One of the things that really got me thinking about this was Michael Gove's request for what he called British values on the school curriculum, but the way he talked about it felt very homo-nationalist. In other words, he was looking at LGBT inclusion as a way to kind of press down on minority ethnic groups, and nowhere was that more kind of visible than in the protests against the work being done by some great organisations like No Outsiders and Educate and Celebrate. And we now have the new inclusive RSHE curriculum, so this is really coming up into people's minds. Some of the things that frame my ways of thinking here include Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality, and then Jo Littler, Catherine Rottenberg and Jasbir Puar have done some amazing stuff around this issue of the co-opting of acceptable diversities to further the goals of kind of the marketisation of education. So one of the ways that you could describe this is when it comes to saying, well, we're LGBT inclusive, but I'm not actually doing any proper work around anti-racism and things like that. That could be called homo-nationalism, and that's what I'm trying to mitigate against here. Now, the Equality Act is a really, really clever piece of legislation. Lawyers hate it because it's so vague. Inclusion, DEI, educators love it because it's so vague and it provides so much space for us to do those positive duties, such as advancing equality of opportunity and fostering good relations. We have our 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act, and of course, included in there are gender reassignment, race, religion or belief, and sexual orientation. And given that this is a legal mandate for schools to deliver, my research questions focused around how schools balance these protected characteristics, how children and families make sense of this, and how we can challenge this notion of homo-nationalism. Another way of thinking about that is to say you could maybe whitewash a school's approach to inclusion by doing the LGBT work, but as you're doing it, not thinking about the institutional racism that could emerge from that piece of work. So we want to do it in a way that includes everybody. So I spoke to children and teachers at 5 schools. They were all very interfaith, multi-faith, a Church of England school, an urban secular school with almost exclusively Bangladeshi Muslim students, another urban secular school with a big range of different kind of faiths, and just a really good range of schools that serve faith communities around England in both kind of very urban and kind of more suburban areas. As part of the research, we spoke to a lot of children from kind of age year 2 up to year 13, some staff members with a really good mix of ethnicities, faiths, cultures, and genders. And my approach to talking about this stuff with younger children especially was not to kind of jump in with any specific pre-assumed questions, but to say to those children, you know, we're talking about LGBT issues in a school serving a faith community, made sure everybody understood what that meant. And then I said, well, what would you ask about it? And then when they asked the questions, I got them to answer each other's questions. And that was a really valuable way of doing this. So one of the things that children wanted to ask teachers was what we would say to their parents, because some of these children were coming home and having conversations with their parents and coming back to school and were saying, that their parents were concerned that their children were learning about LGBT issues and this did not align with their religious beliefs. Teachers found that an area of common concern was related to parents' fear that being gay was a sin in their religion. And one student said that a Christian can't be gay because they would go to hell. And there was this notion that people genuinely worried that their children would go to a literal hell. And this teacher here felt very empathic about that and said, you can't ignore the fact that people have this fear. But the way she explained it was to be saying, this is just part of our equality policy. It's not about trying to change people. It's just trying to educate people about what's out there in the world. Apologies for the building work next door, by the way. This teacher said, I think it must be really sad if you really genuinely believed that your son was going to hell if he was gay. And it was the empathy that enabled her to listen, just sit and listen and open up that conversation and respect the views that parents were bringing. But a very interesting way forward was how a teacher talked about one of the things that's often asked is whether schools should forewarn parents about upcoming LGBT inclusive content. And this teacher said, I just think, why? If I had a Black History workshop, I wouldn't say, hi, parents, I'm having a workshop about Black history. If you're racist, please contact me. Like, I wouldn't do that, so I don't know why I would do that for anybody else. Why would I do that? The other thing that often came out of these teacher interviews was I started hearing this notion of a single lifestyle and this thing called bed hopping, and I was really confused at first. But then I realised that there was this kind of stereotyped idea that LGBT people had some kind of promiscuous lifestyle, and that's what they were worried about. And so teachers would say, well, we don't come out as heterosexual either until we're getting married. So it was this notion of you don't talk about personal, intimate relationships until they're really committed. And once we had the discussion that, it's okay to talk about commitment, doesn't matter if your partner is the same gender or a different one, people started feeling a bit more comfortable about it. Bullying was one way forward. So in LGBT inclusive education research, often the notion that starting with bullying is a bit pathologizing, and I understand that. However, schools know all about how to deal with bullying. They're really confident about it. So if you start with bullying and talk about how this inclusive work is a way to keep all kids safe, and as Hannah was saying earlier, inclusion is safeguarding as well, schools can get on board with that. Governors can too. So governors who didn't really want to say yes or no to starting the programme, teachers would say things like, the thing is, the people most likely to get bullied are going to be straight kids because there's just more of them. We don't want your children being in a school where they're going to get bullied. We don't want your children thinking it's an okay thing to bully about. And one of them said, oh, right, yeah, okay, we get it. One of the school strategies that teachers talked about was mentoring colleagues. So the teacher who was leading on LGBT inclusive education in one particular school said that it was easier to get staff members who shared backgrounds, ethnicities and genders to support each other with doing the LGBT inclusive education. And that kind of putting people together to mentor each other worked really well. And another strategy was making sure that everybody in the community, teachers, parents, kids, all knew about the Equality Act. One child went home and was talking about how they'd been discussing how sometimes a man might wear a dress, and his dad had got very, very upset, and they'd had like a family conference about it. But once his older brother said, Dad, the Equality Act protects us because we're Muslim too, they felt okay about it. So the Holly School head teacher really took the strategy of educating parents about the Equality Act, the legislation, and I'm whizzing through my PowerPoint now because I've got 40 seconds left. The last strategy that I want to talk about is the notion of religious tenets. No religion condones bullying, and most religions will say something like, love your neighbour, and God created us as we are. And just engaging with that language and those ways forward is a way to get everybody on board. Teachers were really impressed with how children were able to balance all of this in their conversations and have thought experiments about it. And it was not until people just kind of got on with the work that they realised that actually it is doable. So just to finish, top tips are to start with anti-bullying work, mentor colleagues, share information and listen to parents at the school gate, lean heavily into the Equality Act, listen to parent concerns with empathy, draw on religious tenets about things like being kind, work with the children's capacity for open-minded, critical and creative thinking, and weave everything through training, policy, environment and curriculum. This is the Educate and Celebrate Charities approach. You can't do it in a standalone way. And I'll stop there and open for questions. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Anna. Thank you. And I know you could have talked for a lot longer because you've done a lot of research and you've got a lot of content, but thank you for distilling it down for us. And we didn't hear the drill too much, so don't worry, we did hear everything you were saying. I just want to go back to a couple of things you said to unpick them further. So I loved your framing of the Equality Act being problematically vague for the politicians and the lawyers, but actually quite helpfully vague for us as educators. Can you just unpack that a little bit further?
Well, it's very hard to take the Equality Act through the court, and recently there's been a great court case which used the Equality Act to say that we should offer reasonable adjustments in schools to children who have special educational needs. And a boy with autism who had what was described as challenging behaviour was excluded from school, and that had to be rescinded because the court upheld that he was protected under the Equality Act. So it's difficult to get these cases to court because it's difficult, you know, how do you define, for example, gender is often one that people will argue about. How has Parliament meant, what did Parliament mean when they talked about gender reassignment? You know, all of these things come up as questions, and that's why lawyers find it difficult because it's vague and they like to be really specific. And I come from a family, half of which is lawyers, so I know where this is coming from. But, you know, for educators and sociologists, you know, it provides lots of space for discussion. And the thing is, human beings are complicated, so we need that space. We're not always going to fit in a box. And that's partly why I did a law degree before I became a teacher. And the reason I switched from law to teaching was precisely because you can't fit people into tiny boxes like that. And somebody earlier, I think it was Joe Brassington, talked about applying for a job and the box that they wanted to tick wasn't there. So they just drew it on. You can't do that in a court of law, but you can do it in education. I really like that approach.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. A great way to challenge it and to model it. And we know that the census this year, it was the first time it asked questions specifically about gender identities, wasn't it? That there hadn't been specific questions before. So we are getting a bit more sort of like modelling the best practice, but we've got a long way to go. Going to your bit about the kind of the children going home having conversations with their parents, that's definitely mirrored my experience that by doing the protected characteristic work with the young people, they have the opportunity, don't they, to actually influence the conversations at home. Do you want to say a little bit more about that approach?
It's so powerful, and it's not just at home either. They can educate their teachers. There was this brilliant piece of data where some kids were doing The Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf, and they were writing newspaper reports about the incident as part of their writing in class. And they started asking questions about how the wolf was being stereotyped. They were saying, you know, not all wolves are bad. Why does this wolf have to be bad? And the teacher realised that in opening up the conversation about gender, the children very easily extrapolated to other things. Another example was they were reading a book called King and King, which is about a prince who marries another prince. And the teacher was doing LGBT inclusive work and talking about, you know, what's wrong with a prince marrying a prince. But the kids piped up and were talking about how someone in their family had married outside of their religion, and how someone else talked about how their sister wanted to marry somebody who was less wealthy than their family, and they talked about classism. And what was really fascinating for those teachers was understanding that if you open up one conversation about inclusion, children are really good at extrapolating and thinking about how it relates to their own lives.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to bring something to the conversation that I know we've been talking about separately via DM, that a parent came and asked me for advice. I put it out to the network about when you are same-sex parents of a child who isn't identifying as being LGBTQI, but you're quite worried about their safety, about how they get treated when they are the child of same-sex parents. And that parent was generally quite concerned about the safety of their child and some of the questions they were asking. Any advice to peers who are also same-sex parents of children about how to support them perhaps in their conversations at school?
They're very often invisible, especially if you're a single parent and you're gay or trans. You'll be invisible. The important thing is to get in there, get known, become a governor, go and do reading in the classroom, talk to other families, make friends, just be out there. If you're out there, people can't ignore you, and your child will take their cue about being proud of who they are from you. So act it instead of just worrying about it.
I completely agree around that visible role modelling. And I think the messages that go home from school. So when one of my colleagues, Benny, did her coming out assembly at school, the children went home and talked about it. And then we then had emails and letters of support from the parents and carers who didn't know that it was okay. Like, it was almost like giving them permission to actually share that part of their lives with us. And we were a really inclusive school. We were quite shocked that they hadn't felt included until that point. So I think one of your phrases earlier on was around intentional inclusion, because if we're not intentionally including, we're unintentionally excluding. So there's something there about the messaging and the communication, perhaps.
Yeah, and that's what I like about the approach that Sue Saunders and Ellie Barnes talks about, with usualizing all the protected characteristics across the curriculum. Making everybody just natural to see all the time is a really great way of destigmatizing. So if we don't talk about things, they become stigmas.
I totally agree. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Anna, and thank you for your time.
Thanks,
It's always
Hannah.
lovely to listen to you. I will see you
Take
soon.
care.